Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this special edition of the updates on ESTA. I'm sure all of you are anxiously waiting to hear what's going on. I know things are changing by the minute, so thank you all for joining us today. My name is Helen Skipsey, and I'm the Vice President of Operations at the Chamber. So excited to see some new faces here and have you all with us today. So first of all, before we get in, I want to say a special thank you to our Advocacy and Action lead sponsor, the lead series sponsor, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. I know there's a couple people here from Blue Cross in the audience, so will you mind me joining me in just giving them a quick round of applause, thanking them. So just to give you a little lay of the land of what to expect today, we are incredibly thankful for our great speaker lineup that we have today. We have Wendy Block with the Michigan Chamber. She'll be kicking us off and giving us some history around ESTA and some of those key changes that are going to be being discussed right now. And it sounds like she has some breaking news maybe from Lansing as well. And then we'll be joined by Sandy Andre from Miller Johnson, and she's going to be kind of talking about some of the compliance. And then we're going to wrap up and have a facilitated Q&A with Kurt Wassing with the HR Solutions Group. So feel free to kind of think about some questions. There will be time. Hannah will be coming around with a microphone in the end as well. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it right off to Wendy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Colleen, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. Again, I'm Wendy Block. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy for the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. The Michigan Chamber is a statewide business organization. We represent about 5,000 members across our great state. I'm not sure showing my slides are in here. Here we go. And our mission is to help Michigan businesses succeed. And our members are across all 83 counties. They're from all industries and really all business types, everything from Main Street businesses on the way up to our state's largest employers. But at our core, we are an advocacy organization, meaning that we go to the Capitol on behalf of the business community to advocate for policies that will help Michigan grow and thrive and help your businesses do just that, and to voice opposition to those that would be contrary to that goal. And ESTA is a big one that we have been working on, which is why I'm here today. So before we get into the what, let's talk about the how. How did we get here? Some of you may know this, others may be still scratching their heads and saying, how in heaven's sake did we get to this point right now where we're staring down the barrel of February 21 when this new sweeping earned sick time law will take effect? How did this happen? And I'm going to give you a little history lesson on how this came to be. So going back to 2018, there were 2 petitions being circulated to go on the ballot. So think about when you maybe go to that beautiful farmer's market in downtown Holland and someone approaches you and says, hey, I've got these petitions. Will you sign your name here to get this issue on the ballot? Okay, so that is what was happening. Proponents of these 2 issues, one on minimum wage, one on earned sick time, circulated these petitions. They got sufficient signatures to qualify for the November 2018 ballot, okay? So they were on their way to the ballot. But before they could get on the ballot, they had to make a stop at the Michigan legislature. And our state's constitution talks about the role that the legislature has to play when issues qualify for the ballot. The Constitution says the legislature can reject or they can do nothing. And in that case, that issue goes to the ballot and is voted on by the voters. If it gets approved, it requires a super majority vote, a very high threshold, for any changes or amendments subsequently. But the Constitution also talks about how the legislature can adopt. They can decide to put it in law, not send it to the voters, but make it the law themselves. And when they do that, they then have the right to amend, to change that law with a simple majority vote, just like any other law that they pass. So the legislature said, we are going to adopt, and they did so in September of 2018, but they said, we don't think the details here work for businesses, and they don't work for employees, as we'll talk about today. And so we are going to adopt, but we are also going to amend. And that's what they did. They adopted in the fall of 2018, and they subsequently amended in December of 2018 with those changes going into effect in early 2019, which is how you ended up with the current minimum wage law and the current Paid Medical Leave Act, which only applies to employers with 50 or more employees. Now, that happened, but then in early 2019, the proponents of these two ballot proposals said, not so fast. We are filing a lawsuit. We do not believe that the legislature had the right to adopt and amend in the same legislative session. And so we had this protracted legal battle. First of the Court of Claims saying, nope, legislature, you can't do this. Then the Court of Appeals saying, yes, you can, legislature. And then finally in July with this monumental decision by the Michigan Supreme Court that said, yes, legislature, you had the right to adopt and amend, but you did not have the right to amend in that same legislative session. Now, if you pulled out your handy pocketbook Constitution that you all are probably carrying with you today, and you look this up in the Constitution, you would see that there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about the window by which the legislature can amend. But regardless of whether that decision is supported by the plain text of the Constitution is kind of beside the point, because the Supreme Court has spoken on this issue. They came to the conclusion that what the legislature did was unconstitutional, and there are no more appeals to be had in this case. So that is why you now have these two laws that will go into effect on February 21. Now you may say, well, why February 21? Well, it's because that's the date the court picked, okay? Doesn't make a lot of sense. They tried to implement it in a way as if they were the day after the election. It's a whole confusing thing. But regardless, they have now picked this February 21 date, which is a Sunday. It is in the middle of a pay period. I get it. There's frustration around that and a million other things. But, we're just the messengers here today. Okay? But I think make no mistake, and I think probably based on the size of this room and that pretty much every seat in this place is filled at the moment, this has a huge impact on job providers and on workers. And there are decisions ahead for job providers or businesses that very well may not work out in the favor of the employee. We talk about this issue first, the light bulb goes on. It's like, oh, I'm going to get 72 hours on top of whatever else, I'm getting from my employer today. It's like, wrong, probably not so fast, right? Because you don't have to do that. You don't have to layer 72 hours on top of everything that you already do today. You just have to have that as your new floor. So Sandra and I are both going to be kind of tag teaming as we go along today. I like to say, and she can speak for herself on this, but the details here in this ESTA law, they are so complex. This law is very dense. It's very prescriptive. It tries to micromanage the decisions you make. And so you're going to hear little bits of information as we go along today. But I like to say you shouldn't consider this to be legal advice. You need to read this law yourself. You need to get into the weeds on this to make sure that you're getting this right as you implement it for your workplace. And so again, just kind of one of these things where you might hear some bits today. You need to do some research and to get yourself in the know and compliant, and you may need to talk to counsel outside of today's meeting as well. Whoop, wrong way. Okay, so let's talk legislative efforts. And we're going, actually, this is not what I'm going to talk about right now. I'm going to let Sandra talk, and I'm going to keep you all on the edge of your seat in terms of what is happening in the legislature. Oh, maybe I am going to talk about that right now. All right, I'll give you, I was going to tease you, but I've forgotten how we are dicing this up. So we at the Michigan Chamber have been working now since July 31st to get the legislature to understand what a big deal all of this is, right? February 21 is coming very quickly. Between now and then, there are only 17 days, right? And we have been working to try to get legislative fixes across the finish line. House Bill 4002 really is where it's at, is the best bill that is out there on this topic in terms of fixing this legislation. That bill did pass the House on February 23 with a bipartisan vote. That bill now has gone over to the Senate where it sits, and they don't, frankly, have a ton of urgency or haven't shown a ton of urgency on this issue so far. Breaking news is that tomorrow afternoon, the Senate Regulatory Affairs Committee is holding its first hearing on this issue. But they're holding a hearing on the Senate bill, which is less than optimal. Frankly, doesn't make a lot of the key changes that I think many of you are hoping for or should be hoping for if you are aware of what is on the table. And so tomorrow will be the first of probably 2 hearings in the Senate on this issue. We plan to testify along with others in the business community, real live business people and employees about the concerns that we have about the Earned Sick Time Act as written, about the unintended consequences attached to it. But what the Senate will actually do and what the Senate actually will pass still is a giant question mark. They do not seem interested in entertaining any exemptions to the law, which is probably a big deal to a lot of you and it's a big deal to us. But on other key provisions as well, there's some sticking points and we'll get into those a little bit later. So we're saying 17 days between now and February 21. When February 21 hits, if the Senate fails to act or there is no deal between the House and Senate on this law will take effect. And so you need to know how you're going to comply, which is where Sandra comes in. And we will talk about our coalition efforts and other things as we go along today. So I'm going to turn it over to talk details.
Well, I'm Zandy Andre. I'm an attorney with Miller Johnson. I'm really excited to hear that something is happening. Maybe it might not be the something we are all hoping for, but getting a little momentum is at least some good news. So let's talk about, as Wendy was talking, right? We are assuming today that the current version of Earned Sick Time Act is going to go into effect on February 21st. So all of the details that I'm about to go through with you supposes that if we have some super good news in the Michigan legislature in the next 17 days, some of this advice and these details will certainly change. So February 1st is the day, right? As when you talked about, this will change only if the legislature makes an amendment. The legal process related to adopt an amendment is over. The Michigan Supreme Court has spoken on that issue and that is decided. The Michigan Department, the Labor and Economic Opportunity Department, will certainly continue to issue guidance related to their own interpretation of what ESTA means or certain terms within ESTA. And so we will continue to look to them for guidance to close any of the gaps. And then, of course, courts will fill in the gaps. We've all got a lot of questions. I get questions all day long. What do you think this means? Well, I don't know. Right? Unless it's defined in the statute, we don't know what could be a reasonable rating, right? Those gaps will get filled as these issues are litigated, right? As an employee brings a complaint forward and says, I think I should have gotten ESTA because of XYZ, right? This relationship should fall within the definition of a family member. Those are the types of things that play out in court decisions. So as Wendy mentioned, right, currently not a lot of exemptions, hardly any exemptions. So the number one question I get, particularly for employers who are familiar with the previous Michigan Paid Medical Leave Act, right, which ESTA is replacing, right? There were certain organizations that were exempt from coverage, but not so with ESTA. So if you are sitting here in this room and you are a Michigan employer, you need to care about Michigan ESTA, right? All employers shall provide Earned Sick Time Act to each of the employer's employees in this state. So even if you are an employer in a different state and you have one solitary employee who performs work for you in Michigan, you need to think about a pathway to provide those individuals with earned sick time as the law provides. So let's talk about employees. Again, for those of you that were familiar with ESTA's predecessor, you may remember that there were certain exemptions related to what I kind of call very part-time employees. Those who worked less than 25 hours a week, or seasonal or temporary employees, those who worked less than 25 weeks in a year. Those exemptions do not exist under ESTA, okay? So it doesn't matter if your employee is full-time, part-time. I get questions about adjunct. adjunct faculty or on-call or substitute teachers, all of those individuals are covered, okay? So a question I get a lot, what about remote employees who live out of state, but their work is assigned for Michigan? At least our current read right now, right, clearly says employees in a state. That would lead me to believe there's at least a reasonable argument that an employee in a different state, even employed by a Michigan employer, would not need to receive ESTA time. But what about temps, interns, independent contractors? The wording in the statute is unhelpful, a little bit, right? The definition of an employee is something different than you or I might think about that term, right? That word means something very specific to many of us in the HR world, right? Am I issuing this person a W-2? I'm not talking about people who do work for me. That is broader than when we talk about an employee, but the way it's defined in the statute right now is very broad. I think it's a reasonable reading to assume that you need to provide this time to individuals who you consider W-2 employees, and you don't need to provide this time to individuals who are properly classified as independent contractors. And at least the Labor and Economic Opportunity Department, the state agency that is going to be enforcing this law, they seem to agree on that. But if you are familiar with their FAQ page, you may have noticed that their answer to that question has changed a couple of times. And I actually don't think that has anything to do with ESTA. I think it has to do with they did not want to be perceived as sending the message that you should just take all of your employees and fire them and make them 1099 contractors, right? So they walked their answer back a little bit, and I think that's primarily the reason. So I think it's probably a good rule of thumb, consult your own legal counsel, but the good rule of thumb that we're talking about, folks that you issue a W-2 to at the end of the year, that's the folks we're talking about here. So what is the requirement? So remember that the requirement actually, right, on February 21st, if you were a covered employer, for all of your covered employees, you must begin providing them at least 1 hour of paid time for every 30 hours that they work. And they can use this time for certain purposes, and that time, those absences or tardies need to be protected from absence discipline, right? So I always tell people, right, think about this as a very mini FMLA, but with a pay component, right? Just like we know that under FMLA employees can take leave, and even if they are gone or if they are tardy, right, if it's for one of the covered reasons and they've gone through our process, we can't count those absences against them, just as so under Earned Sick Time Act. Now, I hear a lot about 72 hours and things like that, so I want us just to pause here. And when you think about an accrual, right, the amount of time that Sandy gets versus what Wendy gets versus what Kurt gets is always going to be a function of how many hours I work for you, okay? So if I work 20 hours a week for you, and I'm an attorney, so you know I'm not good at math, whatever that math's still, right, we're not talking about 72 hours for Sandy if she only works 20 hours a week, okay? But if Kurt, because he's a superstar, works 3,000 hours for his employer this year, he is going to earn more than 72 hours this year, right? So the amount of time any individual employee is eligible for is always a function of how much they work. This idea related to 72 is the amount that you as the employer can limit for use. So Kurt, joke's on him, right? He worked 3,000 hours and he earned 85 hours of paid sick time, but his employer can say, Kurt, you're only going to use 72. Our rule is you can only use a maximum of 72 hours in your benefit year, okay? So that's important to keep in mind. You see a note here related to small businesses. Under ESTA, a business with less than 10 employees is considered a small business. Go remember what Wendy said at the very beginning. There are no exemptions here. So it doesn't mean that if you are a small business and you fit that definition, you don't have to worry about ESTA. It just means that you don't have to provide as much paid time off under ESTA as an employer who is not a small business. Those small businesses, you can limit use to 40 hours of paid sick time and 32 hours of unpaid sick time. Okay? Any employer, large, small, medium size, your newly hired employees, you can require those individuals to wait 90 days before using sick time, but the amount of time they start to be eligible to use on date 91, right, that accrual has to go back to their hire date. Okay? Let's continue talking a little bit about accrual and usage and some of these details. This top bullet point here is probably among the number one conversations that I'm having with clients right now, is this idea related to mandatory carryover. So we just talked about, right, how much time to see in the year is a function of how many hours I work, but my employer can limit my use to 72 hours, so I can earn and earn and earn. And what if I never use any time, right? All of the time that I accrue and do not use in a year rolls over into the next benefit year. But my employer can still cap the amount of time I use in any benefit year to 72, okay? So there's this kind of weird, quite frankly, it just tees it up to be an employee dissatisfier, and how many of your employees are going to redirect their anger on that particular issue to the Michigan legislature and not you, right? Probably not. Right, so there's kind of this weird phantom rollover piece, but you as the employer can still limit use. Probably the second biggest topic of conversation is related to increments of use. So I think when we generally think about paid sick time, we think about 72 hours, and maybe that's almost 2 weeks off, and I think about it in full days. But employees can use this in at least hour increments, if not some increment that is smaller than that, right? So if I'll presume good intent here and say if I have a doctor's appointment this morning and that's gonna make me 1 hour late for work, I can use 1 hour of my ESTA time to cover the absence and still be paid whole for the day. Caveat here is an hour increment is the ceiling and not the floor, and I think this is really, really difficult. Because then now you get to figure this out. The smallest increment your payroll system uses to account for absences or use of other time. If you are 100% sure you know what that means, please raise your hand. Me either, right? I think I talk about this a lot, right? So what does that mean? The question I get all the time is, Sandy, our payroll system routes to the 10th of an hour or the quarter of an hour. And so does that mean I have to provide this time in 10-minute increments, 6-minute increments, 15-minute increments? Maybe, right? But what about this piece or use of other time, right? So if I punch in 8:06 and my time rounds down to 8 o'clock and I'm paid for that whole time, I'm paid my entire shift, and Miller Johnson doesn't discipline me for being 6 minutes late, what's the increment of time I can use for an absence? I don't know. Right? I don't know. So this is a piece I think you should get particular legal advice on, because I think there's some math that goes between your payroll system rounding, the way that you actually pay, and whether you count and how you count attendance discipline and tardiness discipline. I think some of those things need to go together on this piece. Okay. One piece of good news, I should have left this as the very last bullet point, just to leave everybody on the good piece here. So there's no requirement under ESTA that you have to pay out unused time as separation of employment, right? Remember up at the top we talked about mandatory carryover and this idea that a pot could just build and build and build and you've got all this time sitting there. Then what? Well, you can limit the employee's ability to use the time to 72 hours a year and you don't have to pay it out. What I will recommend to you, right, ESTA doesn't require you to pay it out. No Michigan law requires you to pay it out, but the Michigan Payment of Wages and Fringe Benefit Act requires you to say if you are paying it out in your policy. If you are silent on that, right, there is an argument that this time is earned and it counts as wages and is eligible for payout upon separation of employment. So you don't have to pay out. I just encourage you, just put it in your policy what you're doing and apply it consistently, of course. So you don't have to pay it out in separation, but gosh, what if you are super nice and you want to, right? You want to pay out some or all of it on separation. Well, how many companies in here have a pretty high rehire rate? You rehired employees who have separated? Okay, some. I'm like, really? So if you have employees who you are rehiring within 6 months of separation, you must reinstate their paid sick-time balance and allow them to begin using it upon rehire. So my reading of ESTA presumes that these rehired employees have some kind of superior status, that they're not the regular kind of new employee, right? When we're new employees, we can make wait 90 days before they can use it. I don't read that same limitation here for your rehired employees, so that's something to consider as you look at your payout policies, right? There is no exemption as the way ESTA exists today. It doesn't say, but you don't have to do that if you pay out time, right? There's nothing like that in ESTA. So this is a piece to consider. Okay, reasons for use. If you are familiar with Michigan's Paid Medical Leave Act, many of these look very, very familiar to you. And in fact, there's only one new reason, so to speak, and it's the second to last bullet point here. So meetings at your child's school or place of care related to the child's health or disability or effects of sexual assault or domestic violence. That's the only new reason under ESTA as compared to Michigan Paid Medical Leave. But for those who are not familiar with Michigan Paid Medical Leave, take a look at this list, right? Essentially is anything related to my own health condition, right? Whether that's I'm not feeling well today and I can't come in, or I have a preventative medical care appointment, or lots of things in between, or my eligible family members' preventative medical care or their health condition that presumably I'm involved in caring for them because of. Certain reasons related to mine or my eligible family members' victimization related to domestic violence or sexual assault. So that's not just medical issues. It can be court appearances or relocation or legal appointments, because like that. And then this last one here, closure of the employee's place of business, which presumably would be your place of business, right? Or their child's school or place of care because of a public health emergency, or public health officials have determined, right, their presence in the community would jeopardize the health of others. So that last bullet point existed in Michigan Paid Medical Leave. And I remember right back in 2018, I had a number of colleagues and I were going, well, golly, what the heck could ever fall in that last bullet point? What would be so bad that it would close visit? Well, I hope we didn't speak things into existence, but we learned really quick what that meant, which I think, at least now, I think right is helpful. It gives us now a context for what that means and the breadth of the types of reasons. So as you look at this list, particularly for those of you who might be familiar with FMLA, and you're used to thinking about, okay, a serious health condition or a serious medical condition, or you understand ADA compliance, right, which somebody's medical condition has to meet the threshold of a disability. As you look at this list, this is a much lower bar than either of those things, right? This doesn't even mean that I necessarily need to be under the care of a medical professional, right? Even for the reasons related to my own health condition, right? So the bar is very, very low. So just a minute ago, I told you the only new reason was that second to last bullet point. But I think we want to pause here and recognize that the definition, you heard me say, the employee or their eligible family member. The definition of who an eligible family member is significantly expanded under ESTA as compared to what it was under Michigan Paid Medical Leave, right? So you'll see generally kind of classify these as child, parent, spouse, grandparent, sibling, right? But this is
my child, my biological adopted foster stepchild, or my domestic partner's biological adopted foster stepchild, legal ward, those types of things. Same with parents, right? My own parents, step-parents, adoptive parent, or my spouse or domestic partner's biological foster step-parent, adoptive parent, right? So, right, spouse or domestic partner, and that term, right, there's no particular, legal document that anyone needs to have, at least as it's defined here in the statute, to recognize you as a domestic partner under ESTA, grandparent, grandchild, siblings, but it's really, right, the kind of the kitchen sink is this last bullet point here. Any other individual related by blood or affinity whose close association is the equivalent of a family relationship. Raise your hand if you know, but you are certain of someone who would not fit in that definition. I did have someone ask me if a pet would fall into that definition. I don't think a pet is as individual, but I could be wrong. I don't know. The term's not defined. The point here is, right, if you are the employer and, right, Kurt calls me today and he says, Sadie, I need to be late tomorrow because I need to go to a medical appointment with so-and-so. And I believe they are, I have such a close association to them, I think of that as an equivalent to a family relationship. I don't think it's worth your time as the employer to get into a debate with your employee to say, well, tell me more. Tell me more, right? Because depending on what kind of family relationships you have, it might not be a very good relationship. I don't know, right? So the idea here is it's very, very broad. I don't think it makes sense to spend your time arguing about who is in or out of that definition, but just recognize this really can be almost anyone. Okay, let's talk about more good news. Notice, documentation, legal action. So notice. What I think is helpful here, again, Michigan paid medical leave kind of had the same structure, that employers needed a pathway to provide the time and protect the time for both foreseeable absences and unforeseeable absences. That idea has not changed, just the time frame of when an employee must request time off for a foreseeable absence has changed. Under Michigan paid medical leave, that was 30 days, similar to FMLA. Under ESTA, this is now 7 days. But employers still need a pathway to provide paid and protected time for those 6 reasons to employees, even if their need for leave is unforeseeable, right? So the expectation is you can give me at least 7 days notice. You notify me of your need for this kind of leave as soon as possible. Okay? What about documentation? Under Michigan paid medical leave, we used to be able to request documentation. Under ESTA, you can request documentation, but you have some limits. You can't request it at all unless the employee has missed more than 3 days, 3 consecutive scheduled working days. Okay? That's the first piece. So let's say the employee has done that right there. Today is day 4, and they're missing. Okay, you can make the request for documentation, but now you as the employer, you are on the hook for all out-of-pocket expenses associated with the employee getting that documentation. Now, I think it makes sense to pause here a little bit and talk about what that means, right? Most of us who have had any kind of medical care recently, right? We've seen a little notice on our doctor's office little reception window that says, right, we charge $15 for FMLA forms or something like that. So I think it's clear that that kind of a fee would fall into that definition. But what about mileage? Or the time it takes an employee to go get that document, right? I don't know, right? The statute does not specifically say those things are included, but I can tell you in at least a handful of the other 30 plus states who have some kind of paid sick leave law, at least a couple of those states interpret this term to be that broad. It's the time it takes an employee to go get the documentation, it's all out-of-pocket expenses, which could be mileage. So I want us to just think about that particularly as we think about maybe our advocacy efforts for some things that in this law that are not employer friendly and need to change. By the way, I'm not suggesting you pay your employees time to go get those documents or pay them mileage, but just flag it as that's an issue, that gap might get filled in by the courts. And we as employers, again, I'm a management side employment attorney, so you can probably guess I see the world a certain way, right? So a court decision on that could end up in a way that everyone in this room believes is unreasonable, right? I don't know. Legal action, another pretty significant difference for ESTA compared to issue of paid medical leave. In addition to an employee raising a complaint with LEO, the Labor and Economic Opportunity Department through the state, an employee could also file a complaint in court, right? They don't have to go through the LEO process, they can go right to court. And because I know what you all say about people like me, right? The second you get an attorney involved, what happens? Dollars, right? Legal fees, court costs, all of those things, delay, all of those things potentially come into play here as you're waiting to resolve a complaint with an employee. So that's something significant to flag. Let's talk about the protections, right? We kind of just went through some of the very specific technical pieces of the nuts and bolts, but I don't want this piece to get lost either. Right, as I said a couple of slides ago, I think it's helpful, and for those of you who are familiar with FMLA, to think about ESTA as a mini FMLA. In addition to, right, letting the person be on and paying them for the time, we cannot count their absence, their covered absence, for an ESTA reason, assuming they've given us the notice and they have the time available, all those things, we cannot count that against them under our attendance policy. Okay, so if we have occurrences or we have points or whatever system we have, right, these types of absences need to be protected from being assigned occurrences or points. I feel like that's the biggest piece that we need to be thinking about. We can require employees to search for or secure a replacement. That's not something we can allow. We can interfere, restrain, or deny their use of paid sick time if they are eligible. Again, kind of just like FMLA, right? If an employee has been employed long enough under FMLA and they've worked enough hours and they're taking leave for a covered reason and they haven't exhausted their time, we don't get to say no to that. Similar under ESTA, right? They've got the time available, they've requested it appropriately, they haven't yet used 72 hours a year, and they're telling us it's for one of the 6 covered reasons. We must say yes to that and protect that absence. We, of course, can discriminate or retaliate against an employee for using paid sick time. And, right, if I could make this last bullet point glow or have a siren or flash, I would, right? Because under ESTA, there's a rebuttable presumption that you as the employer have violated ESTA if you take any kind of retaliatory personnel action against an employee within 90 days of the employee taking time off or exercising a right that they have under ESTA, okay? So this means that if Sandy used ESTA time yesterday, but today we discover that Sandy is involved in theft in the organization and we want to fire Sandy for that, this does not mean we cannot fire Sandy for that. But this just means, right, today is within 90 days of yesterday, and I'm on the receiving end of some kind of adverse personnel action. There's going to be a presumption on my employer. They have decided to fire me for theft because I used ESTA yesterday. So what to do about that? What I tell clients, and I'm sure, Kurt, you tell clients this too, this is all the more reason for your very, very good documentation, for the reasons that you're taking any kind of disciplinary action, for your very, very good investigation procedures, so that when you are firing Sandy for theft, and she says, I think you fired me because you're retaliating against me for using ESTA, you are prepared when I file a complaint to say, no, right? Here's the video of Sandy stealing. Here's all the stuff we found in Sandy's desk. Here's Sandy admitting to her stealing, right? You've got all of those pieces that you could defend yourself against this, right? That kind of good process, that piece hasn't changed, but kind of starting out behind the 8 ball hats, right? That shifts the playing field, in my opinion. We talked about this a couple slides ago, right? In addition to raising a complaint through Michigan Leo, an employee can also bring a complaint directly in court. And an employee has 3 years from the time of the violation or their discovery of the violation to bring an action against their employer. And the potential damages are listed here, right? Depending on how much time. Right, if we fired Sandy and it's been 3 years and she's bringing it out, right? Back pay or reinstatement might be in the cards as a potential remedy, in addition to attorney's fees, the potential for liquidated damages, which is really just double damages, in addition to certain administrative fines. So a pretty robust remedial statute. So what must you do on February 21st, right? If nothing changes. We at least must begin accruing time for people, for your employees, not people, right? Limited to your W-2s. But you also have to provide notice about BESTA to your employees. And that notice has a couple of required components. And the very, very good news is that there is a poster on Leo's website that does most of the heavy lifting here, but not all of it, okay? So I'm just gonna go back one slide. Here's the information you must provide. Your definition of a leave year, right? The Leo poster is not going to have that because they don't know how you are defining a leave year. The permitted uses of leave, right? The poster will probably cover that. It'll be the 6 reasons. The prohibition and retaliation that is definitely in the Leo poster. And an employee's right to bring a civil action also in the Leo poster, right? So some pieces you'll need to tell your employees. So I generally tell clients is you should have a policy related to ESTA. So between the poster and your policy, that should get you to where you need to be related to notice. So you need to give that to your workforce on February 21st. And you'll need a pathway to providing that information to all of your new hires going forward, okay? Record retention requirements. Oddly enough, right, we just talked about a whole bunch of things, right? Accruing time and reasons for use and limiting rate an employee's ability to take time, all of those things. But the record retention requirements in the statute, right, there are actually only 2 requirements, right? You have to keep for at least 3 years records that show the hours your employees are working, which at least for your employees who you pay by the hour, you should already have. That's good news. And the earned sick time your employees have taken. Okay, so those are the only 2 requirements. What I don't want you to do is walk out of here today thinking, well, those are the only records we actually need to keep. Because we just talked about a whole bunch of other things, right? Particularly about the rebuttable presumption, right? If we want to deny someone's use of time, what's the reason we're denying it, and how do we know we can? Right, so we want to know if somebody's used 72 hours or they're saying that they're requesting time off for a different reason. Something that's not covered, right? We'll want to have records related to that. If we're firing Sandy for theft, we're surely going to want records for that, particularly if we're doing it within 90 days of her exercising some right under arrest. Right, so yes, these are only the 2 statutory record retention requirements, but think a little bit more high level about the things that you will need to do as an employer to be able to demonstrate that you are compliant with this law. And it's certainly more than, right, having records of hours worked and how the amount of earned sick time Sandy has taken. Right, you're probably going to want some evidence that you provided Sandy notice about ESTA on her first day of employment, so you were compliant with the notice requirement for a new employee. Just a couple of examples, okay? Just like always, right, the state can request access to your records to facilitate their own investigation into a complaint or their own compliance investigation, right? Those pieces really haven't changed. They can do that with the statutes that they enforce. But again, if we fail, as the employer, if you fail to maintain appropriate records, or provide them when requested, right, there's going to be a presumption of a violation. So it's very important that you, right, whatever policy you come up with and whatever math you're doing to comply, you've got all the backup to be able to demonstrate those things. Okay, so what the heck now? I've just depressed everybody, but nobody's run from the room. So good job. Happy about that. So if nothing else, here's some things that I think that you need to do. Right? Remember to think about what your compliance obligations are in the first day. It is not required that you give all of your employees 72 hours of time off on February 21st. You certainly can do that as a pathway to compliance, but that isn't the requirement. So take this in bits and pieces and figure out what makes sense for you as an employer. So, right, your obligation is to begin accruals, right? You just have to flip the switch. Easy for me to say, right? I administer paid time off programs to exactly 0 employees. So it's easy for me to stand up here and say, just flip the switch, everybody. But really, your obligation, just turn that function on February 21st. Have lots of clients that maybe their traditional paid time off year is a calendar year, right? And prior to the new year, they said, should we start to provide that time on January 1st? Do you think that's okay? Yeah, you don't need to wait until February 21st to kind of flip the switch. If you want to do it sooner, that's fine. There is some danger that the time you've provided before the law takes effect, you cannot count, right, towards your compliance efforts here. So just recognize that if there's a gap. But then you really need to think about your paid time off benefits. Pull out your policies, right? Think about if you've got a PTO plan, or you've got a vacation plan, or you've got a holiday plan, or you've got a safety days plan. Think about all of those, right? As Wendy mentioned, right, the kind of popular idea out there is, hey, my employer has to give me 72 more hours than I already have. But that isn't the requirement, right? So you can take all of the existing paid time off benefits you provide now, kind of reshuffle the deck and rename things and slap earned sick time on it, and that can be your compliance mechanism with you maybe adding very little dollars to the actual benefit. That's perfectly fine. We'll tell you the majority of clients that I talk to, that's exactly what they're doing. I talk to very, very few people who are saying, we're gonna add a new benefit. Not usually the case, okay? So, but when you think about vacation, you think, oh, everybody gets vacation. Make sure that's true, right? What about, right? We talked about students, seasonals, temporaries, very part-time people, right? If you've traditionally provided vacation time to your full-time employees, think about those eligibility requirements. When we talk about, right, we provide, oh, it's a week or 2 weeks, and that's what we provide in 80 hours or 70 hours. Remember, we talked about that at least right now, how many hours Sandy is eligible to accrue is a function of how many hours Sandy works. So if we want a safe number, right, that we provide to everybody because we don't want to deal with the math, that's fine, right? But if we're wanting to manage that a little bit more closely, think about what that looks like. Take a look at your policies. What do you currently require for notice? Notice of a request to take time off, documentation to support a need for time off, cash out or rollover, increments of use, all of those pieces you've got to take a look at. Right? I have a lot of clients who have blackout periods, right? They have particularly busy periods of time per year, and they don't approve any time off requests during those. Not so with us, right? Okay? So thinking about all those things. So thinking about your benefits broadly, and thinking about if you want to kind of pool those together to make a new benefit, and then to dust up your policy and put pen to paper on what those requirements are going to be. And then it'll be really important, right? I always tell people, right, what are the things that are going to get you in trouble, right? It's when somebody wants to take the time off and you let them but don't pay them, when you discipline someone for being gone, or when you discharge them for being gone, right? Those are kind of the 3 high-level things. So you need someone in your organization to really understand the job protections that attach to use, right? And whether that's your frontline managers or your HR person or everybody, right? You need a stopgap to make sure that somebody who understands this piece is taking a look at any time that you are about to discipline or discharge someone for an attendance-related reason, to make sure that one of the occurrences we're counting shouldn't have been protected under ESTA, right? And that just naturally goes with then we need a revision to our attendance policy, making it clear that certain absences, certain tardies, again, just like under FMLA, are going to be protected from discipline. A lot of open questions, and I'm sure we'll hear some of these for you. But the point of this kind of list here is, Wendy and I know maybe a little insider baseball here, but we're reading words on the page just like you all are, right? And so when you ask me, what does this mean? What does that mean? Right? I can give you my opinion to what it probably means, or what a reasonable reading of it means, based on what we know about other laws that you as an employer must comply with. But a lot of these gaps are going to get filled, right, by LEO guidance or CORPS. And so, right, if you're asking me, Sandy, are you telling me for sure today that there's no possibility that an out-of-state employee could be covered under this law? I'm not sure that I can stand up here and tell you that. I can tell you what a reasonable reading is, but it's important for you to recognize those gaps, right? Make a good faith effort on your own to say, okay, what do we think this means for our organization? And that's how we're going to administer it until we hear different. But recognize that this really is evolving, and this is not kind of a set it and forget it type of law. You're going to see developments here, and it's important someone in your organization is aware when there are changes or decisions or guidance or amendments, so that you can make sure you're implementing those changes. Okay, and like I always say, that's a picture of me when I was young. And so we all get sad. Probably I get more sad. But now I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the conversation going on in Lansing. Give you a little preview that about just what the Michigan Chamber has been working on. We have spent the last 6+ months talking to legislators about the concerns with ESTA. I think you now probably all have a good idea about what those conversations look like and the top issues. Some of the big things we're talking about is just the need to make ESTA less disruptive to workplaces across Michigan. I think the general consensus is that businesses have to make very significant changes to their pay time off policies today, and that doesn't make sense for a lot of you, especially those who meet or exceed that 72-hour threshold. We've been asking for exemptions for small businesses, for part-time and seasonal employees. Whether those will fly is still very much a question. Explicitly allowing employers to front load the time and incentivizing them to do that by then avoiding the carryover and the tracking requirements, because 72 hours will always be available to someone at the start of the benefit year. They have the 72 hours available to them. To give businesses more flexibility to combine the ESTA time with other PTO. This idea that if you do that, you have to provide all of that time under the same conditions, the express language in the act, as you would for all of that time. So that increments piece becomes problematic when you start thinking about folding in ESTA with other PTO. The advance notice provisions are problematic when you start thinking about how you might apply that to multiple weeks of paid time off if you want to keep those banks combined. We want to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach related to advance notice. This idea of set up to 7 days advance notice if practicable, if not practicable as soon as, or if not foreseeable as soon as practicable. And that doesn't work for a lot of industries. We're engaged with like the 911 operators and the sheriffs and home health care and hospitals who are saying, we need to know going into a shift who is going to be there. These are matters of life or death, right? A lot different than maybe say an office setting, and we need more flexibility for different types of employers. And then finally, to strike that right to go straight to court with a complaint. We would like to see these complaints filed with the state and enforcement rests with the state, and to get rid of these sweeping rebuttable presumptions, which already kind of tilt the balance in the favor of the employee before the facts are even on the table. So that gives you a little flavor. We have been working with over 80 different organizations across the state, including your West Coast Chamber, on this. And the idea with having so many groups engaged in Lansing on this issue is that there are lots of foot soldiers on this issue out talking to legislators. And by having your local and regional chamber involved in these issues, they can speak to the concerns that they're hearing in, say, the Holland and Zealand community with a Nancy DeBoer and a Roger Victory and a Bradley Slaw. So it's really great just to see the diversity in this, and I think it has moved the needle significantly. So let's talk about what might happen. We talked about how there's going to be a hearing in the Senate tomorrow, how the House has already passed legislation. And as we start to think through like what could change, I don't have a crystal ball for you today, but I can tell you kind of what we think realistically might get across the finish line and what that final bill might be that goes to the governor's desk. As I mentioned, there are no exemptions, and as Sandy mentioned, there are no exemptions in ESTA today. We have been calling for exemptions for certain classifications of workers to make it clear that, for example, independent contractors are not covered by ESTA, that part-time and seasonal and variable hour workers are exempt. This is a big sticking point in the Senate. I think there is universal agreement around the fact that independent contractors are not employees, they are workers, and they therefore should not be subject to coverage under ESTA. But beyond that, I think we're going to see that the Senate will dig in on exemptions. So I would not be holding my breath that a final bill that gets to the governor's desk does include exemptions. We will continue to push that point, but it may be one that just the Senate cannot be convinced on moving forward. In terms of small business, many of you are probably small businesses in this room and saying, I'm not the same as a large business or a medium-sized business. This is a lot harder for me to comply with because I'm the business owner and I'm HR and I'm accounting, right? Small business and whether there will be an exemption for small business, again, still very much in question. The House did exempt small businesses with less than 50 employees. The Senate version, as introduced, ups that threshold for that 40 hours paid, 32 hours unpaid to those businesses with less than 25 employees. As I was sitting here today, I saw another version of a Senate bill that is probably going to be discussed tomorrow, and they have stuck with that same approach for that 25, 40 hours paid, 32 hours unpaid, and we've spent a tremendous amount of time talking to senators about the need for a small business exemption. So at least at this point, it doesn't seem like they're budging. This could still be negotiated, but I would not hold my breath on that. And again, the messenger on this, it's really the Senate that will get to decide what is in their bill. This idea of combining all of your PTO bank together, an ESTA bank with a general PTO bank, I think there is consensus in Lansing that it makes sense to continue to allow employers to combine all of this time in one PTO bank. But the big problem is just this language that says, if you do that, it says, yes, you can do that, but if you do, you have to provide all of that time under the same conditions as is specified in ESTA. And that is a lot of micromanaging done on your part. And so we have been arguing that we just need to strike this language about under the same conditions, and that will largely solve the problem. So the House bill solved that. I think the Senate would like to solve that issue, but at this point they have not agreed to pull that language out. So that will be one to be watching for, because this is a piece that is hugely disruptive for businesses that already meet or exceed that 72-hour threshold and will force changes if left unchanged by the legislature. Carryover is another big one, right? Like, why would you have to carry over more than 72 hours if you can cap usage at 72 hours in a given year? Well, the House agreed with that assessment, said basically 72 hours unless you decide to pay out. You could decide to pay out. The House version wants to cap carryover at 144 hours, or 288 hours, but if you pay out some of that time, you could get it down to 144 hours. We'll see how that one evolves. Again, I don't really understand the logic behind carrying over 288 or 144, but I guess it's better than carrying over, 2,000 hours potentially after a number of years. So that will be one to watch. Front loading, I think there's consensus that front loading is allowed under the law. It's just a question of whether employers that do that, if they can avoid the tracking and carryover requirements, and some more conversations to come on that piece. Sandy talked about this issue with year one, right? So we talk about how this got this funky February 21 date, and that doesn't make sense. Nobody has a benefit year that starts on February 21, unless I'm mistaken. But I haven't heard from a single member that has at this point. And so there becomes this question of, what if I'm in the middle of a benefit year? What do I do then, right? How do I start? And it says, beginning on the effective date, employees are entitled to accrue 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. But again, not really a question of but if I've already given 72 hours, can I count that time? And the consensus seems to be no. The House version of this bill seems to say yes, or does say, yes, you can account for whatever you've already given in year one. And again, as I was sitting here today, I got this new Senate version, and they seem to be in agreement on that in terms of easing compliance in year one. So that will be something to watch as the legislation moves its way through the process to see if that language sticks. But that could help a lot of you for this kind of year one issue of kind of what do I do? Do I pull back? Do I start my benefit year now anew on February 21? How do I stack this on top of something that I've already given? The calculation of pay is a tricky issue because it says you have to pay the minimum wage rate or the employee's normal hourly rate, but there are issues for employees that are making, say, 100% commission. And how do you calculate that, right? It really will, as ESTA as written, incentivizes people to take ESTA time right after a large commission rate. So the House legislation or a House passed version tries to deal with that and to narrow the definition of what is the rate of pay. The Senate version does not at this point address that issue, but it is something we continue to push on. But that is something that you all should be aware. It's also an issue for industries that have tipped employees. It could also be an issue even for employees that get large bonus checks at certain times of the year, just in terms of how do you calculate what is the ESTA rate for those people. Advance notice and disciplinary actions. This is another big one for the legislature. The House passed version kind of defaults to the employer's policy, which would be extremely nice that you get to decide. Again, this idea that different industries are different and may demand a different approach on this. The Senate version basically only says that if you have mandated staffing ratios, that you can have your own policy, but everybody else has to do this foreseeable, not foreseeable business. So that is something that you'll want to watch, especially if you're in an industry with mandated staffing ratios, and this could evolve moving forward. It's a big issue that we're pushing on. Disciplinary actions. There is a issue with ESTA as written. It says an employer's absence control policy shall not treat earned sick time taken under this act as an absence that may lead to or result in retaliatory personnel action, period. That is a pretty sweeping statement that if you have somebody who takes ESTA time and you want to discipline them for that, even if you believe that they're abusing it and kind of saying, I'm sick, and you don't believe that they are, it creates big problems. And so the House passed version says that an employer can take disciplinary action if the employee fails to follow their notification procedures, but the Senate version does not, kind of keeps with that strict language that somewhat ties employers' arms behind their back. Just a couple more things. There's a big issue here with no call, no show, ghosting, if you will. The legislation says only after 3 consecutive days really does the employer have the right to do anything, and their right is to ask for documentation. And it's really a simple piece of paper that you have to pay for, saying that they had the need to use earned sick time. And so, but because of that language related to discipline, termination, other things, it somewhat creates a problem for employers that doesn't match up with our unemployment statute, which basically says after 3 days, no call, no show is considered a voluntary quit situation. So the House version of the bill basically allows the employer explicitly to take action against an employee if they fail to give notice and to show up for work for 3 or more consecutive days. The Senate version does not address any of those things, so you can quickly see, I think, probably why we prefer this House version of the bill so much more than the Senate version. And then increments of time, the House version allows time to be used in 1 hour increments unless you choose a different limit that could be a higher limit. The Senate version does default to 1 hour increments. That is a good change in the Senate version, because we do believe that ESTA could allow, as Sandy alluded to, ESTA time to be used in as small as 1 or 6 minute increments in workplaces across Michigan. So 1 hour certainly is better than that 1 or 6 minute slicing and dicing. And the House version does specify that an employee can have to be providing documentation within 15 days of a request. There are changes in both of these bills that are positive. Both would eliminate the rebuttable presumption. Both would eliminate the private right of action. And for reinstatements or successions, it would say that if the House version says that if an employee is paid out, that you would not have to reinstate the time. Okay, so let's just talk, because I know we want to get to questions, and there's probably a lot of questions, just about this final push, right? This idea that there are 17 days between now and February 21. We need the Senate to start moving, and to start moving with a sense of urgency on this issue, and to tackle many of the big issues that the business community has around this issue, not things just around the edges that kind of they can declare victory on paper, but doesn't really do anything helpful in practice to any of you. So I would say in general, you have great lawmakers who understand this issue in this area, but I do think it is great to just be reinforcing that. Those of you who maybe live a little bit closer to the Grand Rapids area, the big push really needs to be there with the Senate Majority Leader and some others. But generally, we just need business leaders to activate on this issue, right? Even if you're not inclined to get involved in policy or political issues, if you are anxious about this situation, we need you to act. And so we have some really easy ways to do that. First of all, if you don't know who your state senator is, and really the focus is on the Senate, we have a handy guide to help you figure out who that person is. And it just involves typing in your address, and it will spit out who that person is. We have sample talking points if you want to pick up the phone and just make a simple phone call where you talk to a legislative staffer. We also have preloaded emails, one on minimum wage, one on earned sick time, that you can send. You can add some edits if you like, but if you just want to do a plug and play and say, I like what you already wrote, Wendy, I'm just going to hit send, you can do that too. It literally takes like 3 to 5 minutes maximum to do that, and so would encourage you to consider that. And then finally, as you're leaving here today, you're probably gonna be like, oh my gosh, there's even more to this than I thought. This is crazy. What do I do now? We have a lot of resources that I know the West Coast Chamber has pushed out to its chamber members. We have a sample policy that one of our HR partners has developed. It's got a section for small businesses versus everybody else, so those businesses with less than 10 employees versus everyone else. There are a number of on-demand webinars. We've done a lot of Q&A type webinars that you can go back and look at and view. We have a toolkit that is full of resources, including an FAQ that folds in the state's FAQ. We have kind of one-pagers and legal resources. I mean, there's a ton of information in this toolkit that is available to you. And I will say you might have to enter some basic information just to get access to the toolkit, but there is no cost associated with the toolkit itself. And that is my information. I think we're going to get to questions.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Sandy. We appreciate it. Let's give them a hand of what they shared to us so far. And Wendy, I think you and the advocacy group, we could probably all rally around if you can pull this off to get 4002, the House bill, through. I think we could be next door at Triple Root in a few weeks celebrating together and be pretty happy about that. Start thinking about some questions we want to ask the two of the individuals. They'll come up. We got a separate mic here. We got to have for the recordings. We got to do it from here. But just to start off with a question, and this might be for both of you that I have. Often in new legislation, when it comes through, there's a 90-day delay before the implementation of the new legislation with a simple majority, or I think 2/3 that can be immediate. How would that play out in a case like this if one of these House or Senate bills came through about that timing for both development of a policy before enforcement?
Yeah, so that's a great question about if changes were to get through and signed by the governor, then what, right? There's this 17 days. How would they pass changes? How would that happen? And that has been a big point of discussion, that businesses will need time to catch up with any legislative changes, right? You can't just expect people overnight to make another set of changes to their policies. And so what we would expect is that one of two things. First of all, the legislature could push out the effective date of ESTA 90 or 120 days and just say, you know, you don't have to comply with this new version for 90 to 120 days, or they could push out the enforcement of that. So they could push out and just say to the state, assuming that private right of action went away, the state, while it's on the books, it is the law, the state is not going to enforce the law for this time period. But we would expect there to be some sort of delay in to allow you to catch up if and when legislation were to pass. But again, February 21 is coming. You should kind of be getting everything in order to assume that the law is going into effect as written, and continue to hope and cross your fingers and cross your toes that they help pull this back, and then you can maybe pull back on some of the decisions that you're primed to make.
Thanks, Wendy. And I think Hannah's going to go around with a microphone for people who have questions. And while she's doing that, I'll just throw out the position we've been taking as in our HR group is let's have a draft policy ready. And we probably have 100 of those with many of you and others that we have in place to be ready for February 21 with a quick ability to pivot then to whatever that new legislation would be during that time frame. Another comment I'll make just while Hannah's looking for hands, get ready to your question, raise your hand there. We know they're out there. Is when you're working on this policy, don't forget the policy extends beyond your PTO ESTA. You've got to consider your attendance, not just attendance practices, what you're holding against. Do you have attendance incentives? How are you going to discipline when it comes to attendance? How it interacts with your leave of absence policy, or depending on your size, your FMLA practices. If you have other time off policies, how this affects policies like call-in provisions for holiday. Can you hold somebody accountable differently like you do today for the day before or after holidays without notice? The impact to other policies gets pretty extensive, so make sure you're taking a little more of a comprehensive look than just your PTO policies. Questions? Got one?
Yeah, I have one. So if you are pulling from a bank of time, and we'll just title it PTO, do you have to keep reporting if it was sick time that was used, or do you just have to maintain reporting for 3 years of pay time off that was used?
Sandy, cue you up.
Yep. So under the statute, right, if we look back at those record keeping requirements, there were 2 hours worked and earned sick time taken, right? So I think absent any clarity on that, you need a mechanism to specifically capture time taken for an earned sick time purpose.
Thank you. Next question. Thanks, Anna.
I appreciate what you just said about the other policies, and that's where I feel most stumped from an industry with mandated staffing ratios. And really curious if you can talk more about attendance policy, do's and don'ts, or things to consider around discipline and enforcement of that.
I'll give some high-level ones, then give it to Sandy, but make sure you think about attendance when you get to the point of discipline, that your discipline is thinking about, just like previously with the paid medical leave act, you're thinking through how do we make sure we're excluding ESTA items? How are we excluding, just like we would for FMLA absences today and other protected categories? There could be even some ADA in there before we roll forward with an attendance disciplinary scenario, and do consider what type of incentives you have that are people going to be disqualified or not for based on the absence for ESTA for that attendance. So that'd be a few initially that I have, but I'll turn it also over to Sandy. And just a plug for Sandy, she's not just a great attorney, we've had a chance to work together, she also spent 10 years working in the HR on your side of the table as an HR practitioner. So she knows more than just you got to push that magic easy button to get this to happen. She's been on that side of the table too, so it's a great perspective.
I don't know that I would have much more to add to what Kurt just said, right? Again, you've got to find a pathway to protect, regardless of your other requirements, right? And under ESTA, employees have the ability to use the time for foreseeable reasons and unforeseeable reasons. And so, right, assuming they've earned the time, they have reported, given you notice appropriately, depending on foreseeable, unforeseeable. They haven't used 72 in a year. They're telling you it's for one of these reasons. You've got to let them take it. You've got to pay it. You've got to protect it.
I will just add, if you have an attendance point system previous to the Paid Medical Leave Act, I think about 50% of companies dropped their attendance point systems then. The complication that this will impose on that, when you try to forecast today, we have 8 points per year that we use with whatever rules. Well, what are you going to do when all the ESTA reasons you can't give points to? What's the appropriate point level then when you would begin to discipline? You need to think a lot about that and have some conversations with some people that have worked through that. Next question.
So we were planning on front loading. All of our PTO was front loaded calendar year January 1. We were going to just adjust our amount of PTO. So we have a personal bank and we have a vacation bank. So we get 48 hours to everybody on January 1 for personal and sick. We were just going to take some of their vacation hours, put it into that bank for 72 hours. But I'm in manufacturing, and I know a lot of other employers are in, I've got numerous people that have already used their 48 hours, and we're not even into the second week of February. So now when you get to February 21, and I adjust their hours to 72 hours, do I have to give them 72 full ESTA hours for this year? Or can I say, well, January 1, you've already allotted your 48 hours, and now you get the 48 and 72 for the remainder of the year?
I decline to answer this question.
This is like, I was smiling handing that to you.
So, yeah, I'm plugging my nose, right, closing my eyes. But, right, you have an obligation to at least start to accrue the time anew on February 21st. And what I hate about this, in this exact situation, so many clients, right, that you're trying to figure out a way to balance the books here, right? Hey, well, sometimes people forget we have a business to run too, right, that takes dollars and cents. And so how do I kind of reshuffle the deck in the most cost-effective way? And one of them is, okay, well, anybody who has time available on February 21st, we're going to call that ESTA time and only bring people up to where they need to be. But that rewards people who've already burned through the time you've already given them. And I think as we exist with the language we have today in this moment, that's a very real piece, right? As unsatisfying as that is for every single person in this room, I think there's some risk there in saying that any of the time they took before the effective date, even in this current year of implementation, can count towards your compliance obligations. I have a lot of clients, again, easy for me to say, right, who are thinking of doing something different in this first year than they will do going forward, right? They're just gonna flip on an accrual in 2025 and they're gonna go back to their regular January 1st buckets next year, right? Because they wanna protect against exactly this. Well, gosh, the person who just burned through all I gave them in 6 weeks, certainly not gonna wanna do in 72 more. At least I can, right, make the water dribble a little more slowly and have there be some time that it will take the person to accrue more. So there's some ways that you can balance against that, but none that will be satisfying enough for anybody. That is the real, but that is the real answer.
Here, let me answer this.
Yeah.
So I do think this is one area that could get solved legislatively. We're finding some agreement on this, and despite the fact that, like, you see the very limited list of things that the Senate seems willing to tackle, there does seem to be an acknowledgement that there could be some winners and losers in year one, depending on how employees have already started to use their time. So I do think that there is a potential for that fix to happen. But I think one other thing, if for those of you who like math, I do not, but you know, for year one, a straight 40-hour employee is going to accrue 69.33 hours. So there's a lot of people just to kind of say, well, then why is it 72? And I don't know. Again, like Messenger, there's a lot of things here. I think that many of you would say this doesn't make any sense. Why was it drafted this way? But that is another one. So in year one, as you're thinking about that, especially as you're thinking about, well, maybe I just have to layer another 72 hours on top, just remember that if most of your employees are working a 40-hour work week or less, they won't get to 72 hours in year one.
That'd be great, Wendy. You're on there, right?
I think you have maybe a follow-up and, well, yeah, we got a lot of hands, so.
We have employees, hourly employees that work part of their time in Michigan and also part of their time in Indiana. Are there hours worked in Indiana subject to accrual?
This is like the truck driver situation.
Feels like a Barzate question. What was the question? So, each employer shall provide earned sick time to each of the employer's employees in this state. I don't know how to answer your question.
It's not work. It doesn't say work.
Right? It doesn't say 4 hours worked in this state. It says in this state. So I think that's a good question. I know what I would say to you if you were my client, and I would want it to be privileged. So reach out to your own attorney, but I think there's some ways to manage around that.
I've got opinions on it, but I don't have to be held to that, so feel free to ask afterward.
Here, we're about a question.
Hi, you were talking about the hours worked. Is it safe to say then that we would take out any vacation or other BESTA hours as well? So in the calendar year, if for a 40-hour person, they're not working 2080, but they might be working 1940 or 1960 or something else?
You would have the accrual one for every 30 hours. It depends if you're going to front load or go with the accrual method, but the accrual method would mathematically just track that for you, and you wouldn't have to worry about what that variation in hours is on that accrual method.
Well, and the FMLA piece of it too.
So for non-exempt employees, it says that for an FLSA exempt employees, assume that if they're hired to work a 40-hour week, that you're counting based on a 40-hour week. And that would not, as I understand it, you would just provide 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. The next 10 hours would carry over into the next hour accrued, but you would probably treat, all time, right? Because you're not tracking hours in that situation. So I think it's a little bit of a difference in how you handle it for FLSA exempt versus non-exempt, if that makes sense. But I have talked to members who said, I'm just gonna, this is already complicated enough, I'm just gonna assume that every week, if somebody's just working, that their hours are stable, I'm just gonna count it through. I'm not gonna subtract
if they took an hour of ESTA time, I'm not going to subtract that from the calculation. It's just it's already complicated enough. I don't want to further complicate it. But that's a personal decision, I think, for the business.
Thank you.
I'd pay all our employees, well, the ones out in the field, 100% commission. They might have a full day's work, they might have a half day's work. Some jobs may take 30 minutes, some jobs may take an hour. They get commission on that job. Is there a fair and reasonable practice in terms of recording those accrued hours? Nailing that. That's the hard right now. And I'm sure that's probably talk to the attorney, but.
I will. You go ahead for it.
So I think, right, like you talked about, right, the existing statute does not contemplate, right? There's no contemplation of anybody except who works by the hour, who is paid by the hour, right? So I think there's a couple different pieces there. How the heck do I figure out how much time to let them accrue? And what the heck do I pay them when they want to use it, right? So I think there's a couple of pieces there. There's no great answer. Again, were you giving me all these people are gonna hate me.
I'll give a shot at it.
Right, so I've been talking to clients, right? If you have any mechanism right now that you capture hours worked toward any purpose, even if it is to figure out how to bill for the services they are providing, or right to bill whoever your customer is, or because you need to keep track for overtime, right? Using that as kind of your starting point. Again, it builds another layer and makes it more complicated than it really needs to be. But if you're doing something like that, I think you're in a good position to say, this is the good faith effort we're making to comply.
Sure, okay. My attorney answer is, if you're making a good faith effort to show, here's how many hours this person is planned to work, here's their variable compensation amortized over those hours, factor it in. If it's a non-exempt overtime versus exempt, you can make the assumption of 20/80 hours or 69.6, the 33 or the 72, depending on your map. You're probably going to be in a reasonable place to come up with an estimated calculation of valuation per a time unit for that, but there isn't a lot of clarity on it. So you've got to make a good faith effort, rationale, note down why you had that rationale, and then over time through legislator changes, court interpretation, FAQs in the state, some of that may get cleaned up.
So small creative agencies have in the last 10 years dropped PTO in favor of unlimited time, in which sick days aren't even tracked because it all falls under the umbrella. And I obviously would need to consult with my lawyer, but speculating, it seems like the only path forward would be to scrap the elevated PTO and have to start tracking against both. And that also includes employees who were excluded because of their work time status. Does that make sense? Like, am I really facing that type of scenario?
There's others out there that same scenario. One angle is you could say, instead of tracking all PTO, you would say, I'm going to begin to track just ESTA qualifying reasons as a category, because until we see whether some of these changes happen, you're still going to have to be able to calculate toward rollover, which to do that, you're going to need to understand how much time they actually took off. And it's just going to be more difficult, and it's going to take away that part of the culture you were trying to drive for different purposes.
The only thing I'll add to that is I will say that as I'm talking to clients, many more of them are going to split banks, and in response to ESTA than they ever did when we were talking about Michigan paid medical leave, right? It's because of kind of this idea of opening up my entire bank to being used in whatever increments or with no notice, and the carryover requirements that we want to be able to cash out some and not all. And the easiest, cleanest, safest way to do it, to make sure that you're controlling what you can, but that you can comply, is the split. So I provide that, just as anecdotal evidence from what I'm hearing from other clients, but that does not seem unreasonable, despite how much it cuts into the culture you were trying to build. I'm sorry.
Let's try and read.
So forgive me for asking these questions like again. I just want to make sure I completely understand. My question was on unlimited PTO as well. So for our exempt employees, they don't even have to track. They don't have to submit it into a system to say, you know, I'm taking vacation days on this day or sick time. They just have to clear it with their manager, right? Get manager approval. So with ESTA now, for an exempt employee, we're going to have to, if nothing changes, you're telling me that we're going to have the enter in, I'm taking an ESTA day in order for us to comply with the tracking requirements?
I'll let you give it that answer.
Right?
So here's what I will say. I will say, oops, I will turn it to full. So ESTA does not necessarily require you to change your time off culture, right? I have lots of clients for exempt employees that say, I don't care, Sandy, if you're an hour late because you have a doctor's appointment. In fact, I don't even want to know about that. Right? I don't want to know. We don't even think about being gone unless we're talking in a full day or half day increments. ESTA does not say, employer, you must require your employees to take this time in 1 hour increments and you must track it. The problem, of course, is you don't require them to use it. It is available for them to use. So if you are in a culture where you don't think that will ever be a problem, we're not going to track their use because we don't think people are going to abuse it, and we're fine with them using their entire, that's fine, right? But 4C, again, the phone calls I get, very rarely does a client call and say, just calling to tell you, you're having the best day ever, right? They're calling to say, we've got an employee with a real attendance problem, right? Okay, well, how much? Okay, well, they haven't had exhausted FMLA. How many ESTA hours have they used? None. You haven't tracked any. Okay, well, we'll talk about this again in 72 more hours, right? So that's the balance. It's the balance of figuring out a way to keep your culture. And I think that was one of the questions back there related to how we track time. But if we don't, an employee then has never used the time, and it's all available for them to still use.
Egg, you're freezing. Yes, you're on to that process. I think, Hannah, we're out of time for questions. I'm just going to close the one piece I want you to consider, and that is, what is your communication plan for your employees? As Wendy mentioned, both individuals mentioned, there's expectations in some cases where they're getting 72 additional hours. I recommend for those of you this applies to, starting that conversation with, hey, the good news is, just like with Paid Medical Leave Act, we are already in compliance with the amount of paid time off we're given. We exceed the state's requirements that they're expecting of us assuming you're exceeding the 72 hours of paid time off. What we will be doing as an employer is repackaging, relabeling, and having to adjust how we track to allow us to make sure we stay compliant. But we as an employer already exceed, we're already given the amount of time, and we just need to recategorize. I don't want them to hear we're doing minimal to comply, even though in some of the processes we're trying to work through best scenarios there. But chances are most of you already exceed the amount of paid time off, and you want to be able to say that with some pride on your face. We take care of our employees, time off is important, we already exceed. You just think through that messaging. Otherwise, if absence of a message in a vacuum, the assumptions will be otherwise if you don't provide that clarity. With that, anything you want to close with?
For sure, just a couple things. Feel free to stick around and network. There's still some snacks and refreshments in the back, so you have the room for a little bit longer, or if you want to stay network, ask questions of each other. And if you could join me in a round of thank yous for our speakers today. Thank you. And may Craig the Rock settle that. So we work very closely with Sandy and Wendy at other chamber programming, and Kurt used to sit on our board. So we are very thankful that you are here today. And just know that we pulled this together very quickly, and they made it work. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and for all of you being here. I know this is very important. So thank you, and stick around, ask us any questions, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.